All right, welcome back to the Daily Fantasy Flex podcast. It is Tuesday. We are talking PGA. I am here as usual with my co-hosts Pete and Colin. Colin, what's going on, man? How you doing? I know it's early there for you.
Oh, no, it's bad enough that you picked the morning shift this time, but you also picked the morning after the Blackhawks lost Game 7. So, this may be the grumpiest that I've actually ever been doing this podcast. So,
Wow.
soldier through, though. I mean, I know you had a UNC loss. I got a Blackhawks loss. Pete, I can't wait to see whatever, I don't know. We haven't done it since the Broncos lost the Super Bowl or whatever.
You had a Bryson miscut.
Yeah. But, yeah, that's Pete's, oh, my God, how do I even do this podcast anymore? The Bryson miscut.
Yeah, I'm a huge CP3 fan, so that was brutal yesterday.
Oh, okay. So lousy week all around. So at least misery loves company.
Right. Misery definitely loves company, and an interesting week last week. Definitely excited for this week as well. We have a lot of good tournaments on DraftKings. And, last week, Brian already alluded to. Bryson missed the cut, his first missed cut. And he had that subjective thing at the end, too. It made me nervous, and I still rostered him. But he was like, yeah, I'm tired from all the endorsements and all the travel and all that stuff. So a lot to talk about with that. And, it's going to be a fun week. We have a lot of good golfers in this field.
Yeah, for sure. I do think this is going to be a really good week. Before we get to this week's tournament, which is the Zurich Classic of New Orleans, I do want to quickly touch on last week's Valero Texas Open, sort of what we learned. I think last week's tournament was interesting in that we were having some trouble identifying some stats or golfers or even a sort of type of golfer that we liked. Masters, we particularly like driving distance and greens and regulation. And for most of the tournaments, we had identified a sort of type of golfer we liked. Last week was a little tough. So I'm curious, what you guys learned from watching and tracking and sort of the new data that we have from last week's tournament. Colin, did you anything stand out to you?
In terms of picking up on player stats, no, there's nothing. I mean, course fit is course fit. The routine is pretty well going here. I guess the player that kind of gave me the most questions going forward on how do I do things is Brennan Steele, actually. And Pete, I remember you said you actually liked him going in, and I thought that was kind of weird just because, he did so badly last week. So I'll actually give you a hypothetical. How badly would Brandon Steele had to have done the week prior for you to not want to play him the next week?
I don't know. It was interesting. I ended up not having that much exposure because I didn't think he had a league course history. I liked him initially just because he had pretty strong course history, not in that elite group. Obviously, I value recent form, but it was kind of – he played really, really bad. What was it? He missed the cut by 9 strokes or something ridiculous the week before. Something he had an absolutely awful round on Friday. So, it was bad. I don't know how absolutely horrible he'd have to do. I ended up having him on one of 6 teams. So I thought originally he was going to be potentially a cash game play, and he ended up just a fringe tournament play for me. But, if he would have done even maybe shot an 85 or something, I guess, maybe I wouldn't have considered him at all. I just thought he was an interesting play based on his course history. And I don't know. He was a guy that I liked originally, and he kind of talked me off him, to be honest.
Yeah, that's all. So, Brendan Steele's, I think he's classically that guy that you can never seem to get on the right side of and very, extreme in one direction, right? And, I did want to unpack that a little bit and trying to figure out what that means. Because I asked how badly could he have played because, a lot of our adjusted round stuff is based on this idea of scoring margin and miss +9 missing the cut in last is different than +13 missing the cut in last. And I'm wondering, is there a theoretical, should there be a theoretical essentially cap for what your final score is? Remember earlier in the year in basketball when the Grizzlies lost the Warriors by 50 and it just skewed their plus minus for the first 30 games or whatever. Functionally there's no different, I think, at some point losing by 30 than there is by 50. And those kind of outliers can skew your averages, right? And so I'm wondering if there's a similar thing that we have to worry about in golf where once you essentially lose by a certain amount, it's just artificially dragging down your long-term average too much. But I feel that gets really dangerous when you start capping people's scores because it still is a useful way to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff. Brendan Steele, I was wondering, was he getting dragged down too low? Because I can kind of imagine the scenario where, like, you're on 12, you're not making the cut, you're in last, and you start mailing it in on the course, and you're not playing your best, and that even drags your score down further. So is that something, as a scenario that happens a lot? Do we have to watch out for it? Do we have to implement like rules and cap the margin of victory or loss? I don't know, but he was the highlight case that made me thought about that. That made me think about that.
That's really interesting. I mean, it definitely makes sense, especially if someone is having just a piss poor round. I mean, at some point they're just going to mail it in, like you said. I mean, if you're, 8 shots away from the cut, going into the back 9, and you just shot like a 40 on the front or something like that, I mean, your motivation and your mental focus is not going to be there, and you're probably really frustrated. And I think, we talk about being tilted when we, play DFS. When you're playing golf and you're doing terrible, you can get tilted and just mentally out of it really quickly. Mm-hmm. So something we should definitely look at. And maybe if someone just has this total outlier round, we can, cap that. But if someone's consistently or, somewhat consistently having these just total blow up rounds, certainly have to, be careful to adjust those rounds, because obviously if someone's blown up, there's a reason that they're doing it if they're doing it somewhat often. But, there's some guy who just randomly shoots an 85 out of nowhere. And it's a total outlier. I think it'd be smart to probably cap that. So certainly an interesting question and something we'll have to look into more.
Yeah, I think that, but you highlighted the exact danger of what happens when you cap it, right? Because like as soon as you start capping margin of victory, if there is a guy that consistently starts mailing it in, then you want that reflected into the data, and like you don't want to pick him. So it's like you're going to get more accurate in some areas mm-hmm. and less accurate in others. And the goal is to be like on par accurate overall. That's the nature of rules. You don't get to pick and choose like where exactly you want the trade-offs to be. So it's just evaluating, does the trade-off and implementing those rules help you or hurt you on aggregate more often? So anyway, it's something that's testable and something that we got to figure out going forward.
Yeah, I think it's always dangerous to get rid of outliers in data because, that is part of the data. It is something like I would want to know if a guy's going to mail it in. Obviously he's going to be kind of hurting you anyway, but, like that, I think that is important in predictive power for how a golfer's going to be. I can understand, like, if we find out a golfer has an awful round because of an injury, that's where I think it gets a little more interesting. But just a bad round just because he played bad, I don't think is something that's tough to eliminate for me. But yeah, good thoughts all around. Let's move on to this week's tournament. Again, it's the Zurich Classic New Orleans. The course is the TPC Louisiana. It's a course that they've been playing at for a while. They took a break. I guess it was a while ago back with Hurricane Katrina, but they've been playing this for a while, so we have a good idea of course history, I think. Quickly, I'll give recent winners. 2015, last year, Justin Rose won at 22 under. Really all these scores going back the last 5 years have been really, really low, which I do want to talk about in just a second. We're talking they're usually between 15 and 22, 23 under in the last 5 years. So really, really low scores, which I think is something I think we need to talk about, whether it affects strategy or not. But Colin, I first want to kick it to you and let you give your thoughts on course fit.
So course fit this week, it actually kind of reminds me of the Houston Open a couple weeks ago. The magic combination for good course fits this week seems to be good at driving distance and bad at putting, as weird as that sounds. And we talked about that briefly that week too. It's like, can you get a boost for being bad in a certain stat? And I think that's playing out again this week because we'll get to good fits down the road, but everybody's favorite Keegan Bradley is popping really well in course fit. So are guys like Lucas Glover, and their whole thing is they can't make a putt to save their life. So I believe theoretically in a course where bad putters gain, like in the abstract, and it wouldn't necessarily manifest itself in, that means that non-putting stats are predictors of success. It could just mean that you put a negative coefficient on bad stats, and I'm fine with that. So yeah, that seems kind of be the winning combination. And it kind of does. There's an interesting tangent here because there's a future article in this. I think that like the reason why good driving distance and bad putting are popping is because I think that there's something about like that combination, like because those two stats are correlated, and actually all golfer stats are correlated to some degree. It's like all else being equal, like if one guy can drive the ball 20 yards longer than the other one, he should have a lower putts per round, just because, if you put it closer to the hole every single time, your shots are going to be easier. And so like your putts are going to be easier and you putt less. And that's something that I don't think we talk about enough. Like most of the stats are kind of orthogonal and independent to each other. But I think this week it's kind of showing that like when good drivers and bad putters are popping, I think that's more of like a measure of like isolated putting, if that makes sense. And so I think that's kind of the real like key stat that's buried under the traditional stats about bad putters kind of get a level playing field this week. And that's kind of like that you have to stop and think about like, okay, well, how do we derive like true ISO putting or bad putting from the traditional stats? So yeah, is that consistent with what you know about the course?
I think it's pretty consistent with what I know about the course. I think the other thing that everyone's talking about is being able to hit long irons pretty well. It's known as a really easy course, but the one challenge that people do have is some longer par threes. So there's a big talk about proximity to hole on 200-yard plus shots. So makes sense. There's a ton of birdies out there. The par fives are reachable. There's short par fours. So the long hitters certainly is something I'm looking into, and I know that's something that we're looking at most weeks just because of how DraftKings is set up with the scoring. So I think that makes sense, and I definitely agree with you. If there's a course where the players aren't making as many putts, or they're just making a lot of putts because the greens are so easy, you can definitely weight down the guys who are much better at putting versus guys who aren't. So interesting that our boy Keegan Bradley's popping. I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of other guys, but I certainly can get behind basically people who are poor putters getting a bump, because that's going to be reflected in their adjusted round and all these other things. They're putting, and if it's not that important, certainly it's a benefit that they're not good, because they should do better here based on their price.
Cool. So I write an article every Monday for on the site. I look at stats and correlate them to I look at the salary tiers. So the salary tiers that we discussed here on this pod. So 9K or more, 7K to 8-9 and 6-9 or less. So kind of breaking it into the elite, mid-tier, and then value plays. And I correlate stats to how they've performed in the last couple of years since we've had DraftKings PGA. And sort of how stats, their plus minus fits with each salary tier. And what I found this week actually was kind of interesting. I was looking forward to this pod because I want to ask Colin, I want to ask you about this. What I found is that for each salary tier, there seems to be different sort of stats that fit, which is kind of interesting when you're thinking about trying to model PGA, and especially a tournament. You can't necessarily adjust your sliders and say, okay, I want adjusted course or adjusted round score to be really important for my value golfers, and I want greens and regulation to be really important for my guys in this range, and then I want driving distance to be really important for my elite golfers. You can't necessarily break it up that way, but it seems maybe that's kind of how the data is setting up. So I'm curious your thoughts on the data. Maybe I'm just coming across some weird outliers. I'm not really sure. And how do you sort of adjust where in a situation like that where it's sort of tough to model all golfers is the same? Once you start essentially breaking up your golfers into subpopulations or whatever, like you just run the risk of noise taking over at some point. And it can be really tough to figure out if there's signal there. That's kind of my innocent until proven guilty assumption in terms of like when you see weird stuff in other mid-tiers. And it could be the other way around where like, I guess like maybe certain stat like that. I mean, it sounds like the way you set it up where it's like certain, like when you want certain stats to be important, it's like they only like the high price golfers that aren't there aren't important. The mid tiers like maybe aren't important as well. It could just be that, I mean,
it also could be that high price golfers are systematically overvalued in terms of like their plus minus and their average expected prices. And I talked a little bit about that last week in the articles I was writing about, like, since prices have upside built in, if you're taking long-term averages, then yeah, I would expect them to have like plus minus or a negative plus minus. So it's almost like you really have to calibrate your expectations accordingly about, like, if you know that all golfers in the high price range are going to have a low plus minus, it's like adjust from there accordingly. And like it is that's the bias that I kind of lean towards. Like, don't pick the high price golfers often for like cash games. It's the most exploitable strategy ever. And it still blows my mind that people like frankly roster like over 11K people in like DraftKings cash games, just because I just really don't think they ever pay off enough on average. And we talked a bit about that when Jason Day was the top golfer in the field, Harbortown. So yeah, I get that's a long-winded answer for you, but I'd assume it's all. I think that's basically. I think your setup is true for all tournaments until I see otherwise.
So you don't think it makes sense where? I think like if you're looking at adjusted round score, long-term or recent, as an important stat any week, I agree. But a lot of that is going to be already priced into these elite golfers. They already have, like, a guy that's really priced up is not going to have a bad adjusted round score, or very rarely. So you're not really finding value, whereas with the value golfers, if you find a guy in a really elite adjusted round score, for whatever reason, it's just priced low, maybe he's just coming onto the tour, whatever reason it may be, that's a guy that has an immense amount of value. And that's something I found. So doesn't it sort of make sense where you might want to weigh it a little bit differently depending on, maybe not depending on like subsections of guys, but the lower guys to the top guys, just sort of as it goes up, it just gets less important.
Yeah, I guess the problem is, like, if you hide the price column, then you don't like that. I kind of, my approach is like, okay, I don't know who like the good guy, like the elite guys versus the mid-tier guys versus the bad guys are. You have to derive that organically. So price column is almost like, that's almost like cheating, like, because that way you know who's good and who's bad. The goal of it should be to figure that out yourself and then match them up with salary. So I know it's a super almost like disciplined thing to do, where it's like, all right, but I know who's good, but I know who's bad. But that's the whole point of using a data-driven approach. You have to figure that out yourself.
Fair enough. Okay, let's two more quick things I want to touch on before we get to our players. The first one is the weather, because I think it's going to be important this week. Checked the forecast just a little bit ago. Obviously, this is Tuesday morning when we're recording, so it can change. Definitely important to monitor. As of right now in New Orleans, it looks like it's going to be pretty good on Thursday, pretty windy on Friday, very windy on Saturday, and then it's going to be very windy and wet and thunderstormy on Sunday. Pete, is that kind of what you're seeing, and how do you sort of approach that? I know it's always sort of difficult to project these things on Tuesday morning or Tuesday night, but obviously I think this is going to be a big factor this week.
Certainly is. Saturday, Sunday weather you really don't care about. It's really the weather on Thursday and Friday, because we can use that data and make better decisions based on it. So, Friday, if it's windy, normally it gets windier throughout the day. So guys with early tee times on Friday are probably going to be good plays if that forecast holds true, assuming that the wind picks up from the morning throughout the day. So that's what I'm going to be looking into. Wind is the big factor that I take into account. And we'll see. That's, again, something I'll talk a lot more on my lineup review, or not my lineup review, but when I adjust my models and do a lineup preview, I'll talk about how I'm factoring in the weather. On Tuesday morning, it's tough, but the one thing I will be looking for is the wind.
Cool. Okay. And one more question before we get to our tiers and go over individual players. I do want to quickly touch on just the fact that this tournament is so low in terms of scores. Talked last year, Justin Rose won at 22 under, which is very different than last week's Texas Open, which was just a really tough course in general. And you're seeing, pretty high scores across the board. So I guess my question here is, do you look at raw scores for each tournament? So does this change strategy, I guess, or is it sort of the rising tide lifts all boats economic principle where low scores are just, you can just apply that to everyone and it doesn't necessarily matter? Or does it change strategy for you? Pete, I'll start with you.
It might change the strategy a little bit. Certainly looking for guys who make a lot of birdies because there's a ton of birdies out in this course. So that's something that I'll take into account. He's not in the field, but I believe he's not in the field. JB Holmes isn't in the field, is he?
I don't think so. No.
Yeah. He's a perfect example of a guy who's just going to make a ton of birdies, might make a little bit more bogeys than someone. But guys that are, doing that are going to pop in general on DraftKings. But there might be even more weight for those guys this week just because there's so many opportunities to make birdies, which is why we see all the low scores. So guys who are consistently making more birdies might get even a slight bump for me. And it is interesting just looking at some of these guys. But JB Holmes would be a guy that just off the top of my head who's already a great golfer, a top 10 machine, one of Colin's guys that he likes in general. But he would be a guy that would get a slight bump. And there's some other guys we'll talk about that I think maybe you can give a little bit of benefit to because it is an easier course, especially from a birdie making standpoint. But I'm not going to go crazy because it is the same course that everyone's on. Curious Colin's take on that because I don't think I have necessarily the best answer there.
Yeah, I think everybody kind of gives a lot of the same approach where it's like, all right, well, find guys that make a lot of birdies, right? It's like my reaction to that kind of thing is always like, well, aren't you doing that anyway? Like, you're never like, I want to find someone who makes double bogeys and doesn't put up points. I think that's my winning strategy. Like, no one's going to do that. So it's like, Brian's question is basically like, what do you do differently when it's easy, if anything? And I think there's this huge urge to do something differently. And I honestly struggle to figure out what would I do differently on an easy course. The way it plays out, I think maybe it puts a slight more emphasis on you want guys that are going to make the cut because on an easy course, that's those extra 2 days of play, the golf is going to be way bigger, but you want guys who are going to make the cut anyway. So theoretically, if you could maybe trade off even more upside for cut making, but you do that anyway for cash. So I don't think you're going to get in too much trouble if you just don't change your decision process as an easy course. The only way that it may play out differently is if you believe that for whatever reason, certain types of golfers do better on an easy course than a hard course. And maybe it's the lower tier golfers, we're going to do that you pick them because it's easier and the gap is narrower between them and the elite. I don't necessarily know that that's actually true. I think you have to assume a rising tide lifts all boats until you can prove conclusively that there's a type of player that reliably does better than expected on easy courses relative to the field. So I'm not changing anything because I haven't found a compelling enough angle that it's this is clearly different on an easy course.
Yeah, I guess I thought strategy change. There's a specific ratio of, sort of value of a birdie to a bogey, and that's set by DraftKings. A birdie is 3 fantasy points and a bogey is negative 0.5. So I think maybe you could potentially change the strategy because, in a normal course or a harder course where you're going to have sort of a more even distribution of those two stats. Whereas this week, maybe you take guys who not necessarily get a lot of bogeys, but you're more willing to take guys who have bogey potential if they have elite birdie potential. Whereas on a different week, it might hurt them more. I don't know. Am I stretching here?
That's
it's not too much. That actually kind of touches on the whole, the mythical, you want a guy who goes birdie bogey better than more than par. And that theoretical player is for fantasy purposes. I agree, but personally, I haven't. Pete, I know you mentioned something like JB Holmes or whatever, but I feel like that type of player should pop organically in your process rather than actively seeking him out. So that's kind of where it's okay, who would you pick differently you're not going to pick otherwise?
Right. Yeah, I was kind of trying to say exactly what Bryan said there at the end, but I totally understand what you're saying, Colin. They should be popping organically, and they should be popping in all sorts of formats and tournaments because that's what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Cool. Yeah, good discussion. I definitely think that was important to hash out. Let's get into our player discussion now. So we're going to do it by tiers like we normally do. Our first tier, which I talked about before, the elite tier is 9,000 on DraftKings or more. Middle tier is 7 to 8, 9, and then the value tier is going to be 6, 9 or less. Colin, I'll start with you. In your models, the guys 9K or more, who's popping for you?
So, I mean, the top three price ones are like they're definitely slated to do the best. Like, Day, Rose, and Fowler. Are they going to pay off their price? Like, I mean, that's always the question with the top guys. It actually almost doesn't depend on if they're going to pay off. It's really, can you find enough value in the lower tiers to justify paying them off? Pretty similar to every other sport. But I know that the top tier seems pretty just straight up correlated with pricing, I guess, this week. For those that think like that next tier between Horschel, Hoffman, and Berger seems really high priced, it's because they actually they all have really good course history. So I know that they were kind of like they seem a lot cheaper these past couple of weeks, but I think that price rise is justified. So I'm actually kind of like they're all kind of equally there along my indifference curve, I guess, in terms of like expected points. I don't really have like I don't know, like that they're all kind of the same. Like I could see myself going in and picking any one of them as long as I can find the right value to get I mean, if I can't find value, I'd probably lean towards the sub 11K guys. If I can find enough value, like, yeah, I could give Fowler or Rose a flyer, but like none of the top guys have amazing course fit, but they're still playing well. So I don't know. Pete, is there anything subjective that separates any of the top tier guys beyond like their prices or anything that's not priced in?
I mean, I'm kind of with you. I think everyone in the top tier is a pretty good play, and it's just all relative to the rest of your roster, where you can find value. I mean, I love Jason Day. I think Justin Rose might be the most popular. He's the highest rated golfer in my model, Justin Rose, so maybe I give him a slight bump. He's had amazing course history here as well. Only guy that I like maybe a little bit more than everyone else is Daniel Berger. I really love his ability on a course like this. He has great driving distance. He's a younger golfer who's kind of coming on, and he had a great finish last year. So he might be the guy I rate a little bit higher than the rest, and he's a little bit cheaper than everyone too. And I just think he's a guy who might be improving at a higher rate than some of these other golfers just because he's really young and up and coming. But certainly that could be a noisy thing that I'm thinking about and maybe a little too subjective. But he's a guy that I like a little bit more than the rest of the group. And I guess if I had to weight one of the top three studs higher than the rest, I guess it'd be Rose just because he's popping more in my model in the course history. But it's tough. I don't feel strongly about any one of those guys really. Even Berger, I think it wouldn't shock me if any one of the guys like Hoffman or Horschel did better than him. So it's a tough week at the top. It's really more about figuring out who you like in the mid-tier and the low-tier ranges, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Actually, yeah, I guess maybe the fades are the more interesting one. I think the two easy fades for me actually are Chris Kirk. I don't understand why he's priced as high as he is. Like, I don't think a lot of people are going to be picking him anyway just because he hasn't done anything.
People love Chris Kirk, actually, I think.
Really?
I've seen him touted already. He's got a lot of top 25s in his last starts. I don't know. People are.
I don't get that one.
I'm not going to play him.
No, if people are touting that, then like that's the one where I'll say like no, I pass. And then the only fade for Smiley is actually a fade for me. And I'm trying to figure out why. Did he go to like was he an SEC golfer? Or is this like a home course type of thing? I forget.
I think he was an SEC golfer. I think he's an LSU guy. So.
Yeah, I was wondering if that's a whole like. Is that an angle for you, by the way?
Yeah,
like,
he went to LSU. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely. I like it. I mean, last week we saw a lot of guys from Texas like Ryan Palmer, Charlie Hoffman do well. I mean, I certainly think it's something when you get into your home state, especially if you have a familiar place to stay. And that's the thing, Colin. I'm starting to buy it more and more. We didn't talk too much about it with Bryson, but the comfort level and just like the mental fatigue and just where they are, I think plays a bigger role than maybe we were even giving it credit for. I think obviously people get carried away and weighted too much, but certainly something that the data might not always be picking up is just where these guys are from. Is there a reason they might have played this course a lot more? Are they staying at home? Like last week, Ryan Palmer was probably just staying at his own house. And I definitely am going to give a slight benefit to the guy who's staying at home versus the guy who's in a hotel. And I know that's really subjective, but certainly something just from watching every round this year and just really trying to be plugged in on the PGA Tour. That's something I'm starting to weight just a little bit more. So with Smiley, I love his talent, and the LSU thing could be a thing, but I can understand the reason to fade him too.
Yeah, to your point, I actually don't like that. That's not. I wouldn't dismiss that angle at all. And I think Home Field Labs, and they were still doing stuff. I think they actually did a whole side project about like golf courses within 50-mile radius of home, and they said like they did quantify like home field advantage. It is something. When I was kind of developing my original approach, it was like, 47th on the list, just like because I still want to get the fundamentals down. But like, there's always bells and whistles to add to the approach. And if you think that it's something that could actually like pay dividends a decent amount, then like that's a testable hypothesis, basically. Figure out their hometown, do like every course has a lat long, like set your 50-mile radius and kind of see like, of the people that have home field advantage, what's their plus minus basically. So that's a testable project going forward. I wouldn't dismiss that at all. I think it's a very viable approach. So I just have to know, like the whole point is how much do you weight it? So that is TBD.
Right. And I don't think you weighted a ton. I think there's other factors that are far more important, especially like adjusted round and things of that nature. But those are the little things that I definitely think, like you said, they're kind of bells and whistles to the whole process. And I would love to see what the data, bears out in that stuff. So, yeah, Smiley's an interesting one. I think I think in general, some of the sharp DFS guys like him, and that's a talent thing. He's another guy that it's tough to kind of gauge him because, he's so young, he's so talented. And there's a little bit of variance in his results as we saw in the Masters. He played awesome on Saturday, then on Sunday, had a chance to get off to a hot start, missed a really short birdie, and then, the wheels fell off. So he's a tougher guy. These really young golfers, and that's why I mentioned Berger too. They're the guys that I'm willing to think there's possibility that they could have dramatic improvement. So Smiley's an interesting one. The other thing that I'm not sure you're probably aware of, Colin and Bryan, is that Smiley Kaufman, Justin Thomas, Ricky Fowler, and I think there might have been one more. They all went on this Bahamas.
Oh, the banana boat vacation. Or
yeah. And Spieth was there, obviously. Spieth and Justin Thomas, there's a picture where they looked hungover. Smiley's out there. And, that's got to be good for Smiley hanging out with those guys. They're obviously still playing golf and stuff. So, I don't know. There's some small stuff here subjectively that makes me bump Smiley a little bit, but damn, he's expensive relative to Smith.
Yeah, I just can't, like, even if you give him like a 5% boost, like I just can't strike. I don't think there's gold in them, their hills in terms of like an undiscovered angle. Like,
sure, and I'm behind that. If he was like 8,000, I would love him.
But easily. Like that'd be a lock at 8,000, but 95 is just, I agree, too expensive.
So, Colin, you were talking about how you like a lot of these guys. Obviously, you just gave 2 fades potentially, but you said you like a lot of these guys in the top tier. Is that relative to their salary or just in general?
Yeah, relative to their salary. Yeah, exactly. So, like, I could like bait like in a kind of initial lineup build. Like, there's like there's no like none of them are popping consistently where it's like, okay, definitely put this guy in. So, like, I could see myself picking any one of those like 6 or 7 guys, like depending on what shakes out in the lower tier.
Gotcha. Before we move on to the middle tier, Pete, you got a popular fade or a fade you're employing on this tier?
I probably won't have Billy Horschel at all, even though he helped me out last week. I went down the subjective train when he said he loved the course, and I played him. And
he wasn't bad.
We talked about how he popped the models, but then he had like the thing that happened late on Wednesday, and I'm still upset with myself because I didn't react enough, but. Billy talked about how it was one of his favorite courses. I know Fitzpatrick blew that the week before, but I'm still going to – anytime I hear that, I'm going to give a slight bump. So he was already rating well, and I got him in. But then obviously Bryson talked about how he was just so, worn down. He's talking about how he needed to sleep on the plane and just the sponsorship deals and all that stuff were wearing on him. And I'm going to try to be a little bit more in tune. But the reason I'm going to fade Horschel this week is just because of the price. I think that – he's a good play. He's not a great play, but if I'm going to play someone in that range, I'm definitely going to play Berger over him, and I'm definitely going to play Charlie Hoffman over him. So for that reason, I guess he's a fade.
Fair enough. Colin, I know that you're always team fade the previous winner, but is that just tougher this week? Justin Rose looks really good as far as the stats and sort of how he matches up with this. I know maybe his ownership is going to be high, but are you more willing to fade him less this week because of how good he looks in this tournament?
Yeah, he's actually doesn't pop, he doesn't pop like dramatically as much of like the fade the previous winners. It's funny you mentioned that because I actually thought like, oh man, like this is the one week that I could see myself breaking my rule or whatever. Like, if Win breaks the right way and he's in the better group, then like, yeah, there's conceivably a path to like I could roster him. But again, I think that depends way more on the middle tier and basically finding enough value because I'm biased against like the previous winner this year is like already priced really high, so it almost like it doesn't depend on him. It depends on what's in the value tier.
Yeah, and last thing on this tier, Colin made the best point. Well, we'll see how the tee times break, and we'll see what the wind is like. That's going to easily like if the wind is substantially higher on Friday afternoon than it is Friday morning, that'll easily be the tiebreaker for me and all of these guys.
Yeah, I think it's a 4 mile an hour difference. That's huge. Like in terms of like like we've been lamenting like the weather decisions have never been clear cut. Like in the past like 6 weeks, this one is shaping up to be a just don't overthink it. Like the wind is going to be huge.
Right.
Cool. Yeah, no, I do think that is a great point. If all of these guys are sort of equal plays relative to their price, you kind of bring in other factors, and maybe wind and weather is the tiebreaker there. Okay, let's move on to the next tier. It's going to be the middle one. Is going to be 7,000 on DraftKings to 8,900. And Pete, we'll start with you this time. In that tier, middle value tier, who's popping for you?
Well, one guy pops more than anybody in this whole thing, and I'm curious if he's popping for Colin as well. But probably my favorite play of the whole week, and I hope it's not ruined by weather, is Charles Howell III.
Damn it, that was mine. I knew you'd pick. All right, keep going.
And he's the pure nuts, and everything that you talked about, Colin. He's known as like an incredible ball striker, has great driving distance, looks like a stud out there, and then he just falls apart on the greens. So everything that you talked about, Colin. With course fit, made me like him even more. He's already ranked second in my model. So he's just a lock for me unless there's a big issue with, if he has the worst tee times, I'll probably still play him. But, he's the guy who's popping the most. I think Lucas Glover, Colin alluded to as well. He's popping. Luke List, who I had in like 100% of my lineups last week, he's popping as well. Jamie Lovemark's another guy who I like a lot for tournaments. He's getting touted a lot, though, so his ownership might be high, but he's a guy who's a little risky because he misses cuts. Keegan Bradley's popping, and then Patrick Rogers. So I'm sure that lines up pretty well with what you're thinking, Colin, just based on how you describe the course. But I do feel better about my model this week than I did last week just because I think the course fit's a little easier. So Colin, who do you like? I know Charles Howell, you said it's a frustrating one. That
was the far and away, like at that range. You said it. He has everything going for him. He's like far and away the best in this tier. The only one that I disagree with, and I was kind of surprised to see that name like in your lineup review this week, and kind of everyone else. Everyone else had Luke List. He's just like, he doesn't pop for me as high. There are a bunch of guys above him that that are ranked higher in models. Like maybe his just everyone else seems to be higher in him than I am. So
that's a good fade then. He was heavily owned like in like high stakes.
Yeah, but like I would have faded him last week too, and he turned out really well. He's the one where it's like, okay, what am I missing? But like
he hits the ball a fucking mile. Sorry for the language, but that's the thing, and the reason that he's going to be. The reason that I think he's a good play this week, there's a lot of emphasis on proximity to hole on 200-yard plus shots, like iron shots, and he's pretty strong.
I'm getting good courses from him. Don't get me wrong, but I think maybe it's just like models are disagreeing with his overall level, if that makes sense. And like I'd probably have to unpack him to be like, okay, what are his exact results? Is there some set of tournaments that everyone else is missing? Or web.com angle or whatever. But I don't know. Other people are like that. Let's see. Charles Howell, like all the guys had Lucas Glover's there. Jamie Lovemark's up for me too. Keegan Bradley. Other guys, Gary Woodland. I know you're a fan of him in general. He's popping pretty high too. I think he has like a decent course fit, and I think he fits the profile, it seems, of what like long hitter, bad putter. Is that like that's what he pops in models?
Yeah. He's a bomber. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into his exact putting stats, but yeah, I like him in general. He's been a guy I've been playing for years, and definitely he fits the mold. What's his price this week? He's not high. Oh, he's 8,000. That's a good price for Gary Woodland, actually.
I think so. Yeah, I think so too. Other guy that might be under the radar a little bit, Byung-Hun An. I know he's coming off of, I think it's like a neck injury or something. So maybe like I don't like, injuries are always the how do you account for that? But like he's like, you know, his backlog of results. It's not like, I mean, it's Euro Tour heavy for sure. And there's, you know, but I think he's right. I have him right around love mark basically. So maybe if you're looking for a pivot, like I'm sure he's going to be less owned than love mark, especially if he's getting touted. So I think that's a decent way to go contrarian at the same price. So just swap them out if you're looking for a contrarian.
I like that call. He was the guy at the Masters who said, "Don't play me because I'm hurt."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like
the
Korean Will Wilcox, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Well, speaking of what, Wilcox is actually, I actually have him right at like kind of at the same level as Patrick Rogers this week. It's like that's one of those guys where it's like, man, tough to pull the trigger after a missed cut, but you know, like you got to make those hero calls every once in a while and be like, you know what, there's variance. Like if it's priced in and he's cheap enough, like it's not going to stop me. So yeah, those are kind of like I think there's between like Glover, Rogers, and Wilcox, I think there's actually enough value here, you know, pending weather that it may be enough to push me to rostering some of the upper tier like prices. So I think they have enough value here in kind of like the low 7,000s.
Right, the low 7,000 is definitely a popular range, and it is interesting. I thought List would pop for you, and just kind of looking through him more. I mean, he has really strong drive. His long-term form, 312.6 yards in driving distance. Short-term is a little bit worse, but he hits the ball really far, and that's, I think, why a lot of people are on him in general.
Yeah, I think if I'm looking at what's weighting him down, like there's this whole, like, I mean, this depends on, you know, what's your time frame window, but just popping up his game log, like he closed the season with a bunch of missed cuts. There's just a decent amount of missed cuts in here that I think is weighing it down. I mean, what is his missed cut percentage relative to everyone else in the field? Yeah, I just think it's decent. It's still a little bit low. 46% isn't great compared to, like, you know, you get some maybe like 34s or some 21s, some 28s, like in the same price range. So I don't know, just maybe, too many missed cuts.
That's fair. And maybe I'll have to look at him a little bit more because he was popping quite a bit. And that's probably because I have driving distance weighted pretty heavily. And, you know, he's not like a super young golfer. I think there's a misconception that he's like really young. He's 31 years old. So it's not like, you know, some people are talking, oh, he's making this huge jump. This is a spot where I'm not going to buy that just because he's a little bit older. So, you know, Smiley, if you tell me, hey, Smiley just turned the corner, there's a swing change or what, you know, there's something that he just did, and now he's starting to really click and you're going to see a major ascent, I can get totally behind that. Luke List, 31 years old, I think we're seeing what we're seeing with him. So that's fair. Maybe he's a really good tournament play and not as good of a cash game play given his driving distance.
Fair enough. Colin, I need to ask you before we move on. Your favorite golfer, he's your Bryson, I feel like, Chez Reavie.
Yeah, I forgot something. Yeah, this week in Chez Reavie. I mean, he's there. I mean, he's playable, like, you know, like he always is. But, like, I can actually find a fade for him this week just because his course fit isn't great and his course history isn't that great, actually. He doesn't, like, I mean, he's not a long driver, bad putter. He doesn't fit the mold. He's not getting a boost from course fit. So, like, he's fine. Maybe, I mean, you know, again, if weather breaks, I could see him rostering him, but he definitely doesn't pop like he has been in weeks past. Maybe that's just because, like, his price is catching up, and clearly we've ruined him single-handedly.
I've ruined him single-handedly. I feel so bad.
That's why you have ruined him.
I'll take 100% of the credit. I get on Colin's guy, start touting him. His ownership goes up. Talk about how he can't, you know, he's just an ultimate cut maker. And as soon as we start touting him really heavily, like we did last week, same thing with Bryson, he missed the cut. So classic pride comes before the fall. And
yeah, exactly.
He was your guy, dude. And when you were the guy just riding him, he was making every cut. Now that he became like it's like a hipster thing, you know.
Exactly. I like Chez Reavie's first album way better than his second.
Right, exactly.
That's great. Yeah, and then Pete mainstreamed him in a room and did.
Yeah, no, I screwed that up. I'll take all the blame on that one.
That's fine.
Cool. Okay, let's move on to our value tier, and then we'll kind of wrap it up with maybe some lineup construction takes, because I do think it's interesting if you guys think that this top tier is pretty appropriately priced. I think it's going to be interesting to see, how to build lineups this week in cash and tournaments alike. Maybe if there's, some value in that 7K range, or maybe if we find some guys we like here, maybe you can let us pay up for day in rows. So Colin, I'll start with you. In this lower tier, is there any good guys, any good players you're finding?
Yeah, I think the great nexus of value and like doing well is Scott Pinkney, who I think has never popped for me in any of these things before. There's nothing in his recent game log to suggest that there's something like that, there's no recent results that points to like, okay, like he's just playing better overall. So I was trying to unpack what's going on here. I think he just has a great like combination of both course fit and course history. So I think like when people focus on course history, they tend to go like pretty like his course history is based on one tournament. So like again, sample size beware, and like maybe it's just too noisy, but I think, he had like a top 15 when he was like a nobody last year. So it is pointing to something, maybe getting weighted a little bit too high, but I think it's something to look at. I think between actual course fit and course history, I think he may be a great under the radar thing. Other guys, I kind of have the usual suspects in the sub, 7,000 range. Hudson Swafford is up there. Nick Taylor is kind of popping again. I know we talked about him briefly last week. I haven't seen, I didn't even keep track of him. Do you remember? I don't remember how he did. Roberto Castro is definitely in there too. Robert Streb makes a cameo appearance. Like he used to be like a top 20 golfer, and I don't know what happened to him. Maybe he just like forgot how to play golf, but maybe he's getting to that point where he's actually priced too low. I don't know. But yeah, if I had to focus on one, like it looks like I'm going with Scott Pinkney. Other guys, like if you want to go really cheap, just because if you want to go straight up the bottom of the barrel, I'd probably go Chesson Hadley is probably the guy that's popping like way low at that. I think he's a similar case where like he has like, I think he has really good, he has like actually good course history, I think. What's he showing? No, it's another one, a one-off top 10. So again, maybe that's too low sample size. But yeah, I think, yeah. And then Michael Kim, who we talked about last time. And he actually posted a decent score last week. It's like a top 25 or something like that. So maybe he's turned the corner. Maybe he can get over the hump of the miscut. And he's in that, like, just underpriced range. So those are a lot of names. Pete, anything that rings a bell? Agree, disagree?
The biggest one is Scott Pinkney, or is it Pinkney? I don't even know how to pronounce his name, but I've seen some sharp guys roster him in the last couple of weeks, which was interesting to me. And now he's popping. He's the highest guy who's under 7K in my model, so I like him. The guy who's right behind him, who you didn't mention, is Bronson Burgoon. I don't know how to wait for that. It's probably just the driving distance that is.
I think so too. Yeah, I think like that. I mean, I scan by him and see like, okay, he has great distance. Am I missing something? But I just think his overall results are.
I was just looking at his log. It's not impressive, so I'll probably dismiss him. It's just one of those things where if you start weighting driving distance a lot, it's gonna, certain guys who just hit it far, but are bad golfers are gonna pop a little higher in your models. So. He's an outlier that I'll probably toss, but he's popping. Another guy who's kind of high is Norlander, who I'd never even heard of. I don't know if I'm going to touch him. Yeah, Hadley's the other guy I was going to mention. He's ranked, I think, the fourth highest out of my guys that are low, and I think he's a good play relative to his price. And he's a golfer that I actually know and I kind of like. So we'll see if roster construction leads me this way. If I do pick one, it'll probably be Pinkney or Pinkney or whatever. Mm-hmm. I'll learn how to pronounce it hopefully from watching him this week. And yeah, that's really it. I think that there's a lot more value in that low 7K range than there is 7K and below.
I agree with that completely. You have a lot of options, and just like, and I think Charles Howell, who I think we're all just saying is a lock this week, is going to be like, that'll free up a lot of money too.
Right. Yeah. Charles Howell, a couple of guys in the low 7K range, and then you can kind of go another direction. And if you really want to fit Day and Rose, or one of them, maybe you throw in Pinkney.
Yeah,
that's kind of where I
I have this week there's a clear path to rostering the top guys, and probably I've seen like maybe since the beginning of the season, maybe since like Torrey Pines, but it's definitely like I feel like I'm breaking my own rules, but that's the way it shakes out. Then data don't lie.
Well, and the other thing, too, we kind of talked about it at Heritage. This is kind of similar this week. I mean, you look at Rose, Day, and Fowler. They're really, and even Day, I still think Day is just like when he's at his peak, he's just in a different tier of golfer. He's really an elite guy with Jordan and Rory. And obviously, Rose and Fowler are very close. But the next guy in the list, they're not the same quality of golfers. So that's something, it's obviously priced in. Day's 12.5, Rose 11.8, and then you got guys like Berger and all these guys in the low 10s. So there is that price gap. But certainly something to be cognizant of, especially for someone like Jason Day. He's the one guy that I'm most intrigued by just because I'm such a believer in his talent. And he did say he was mentally fatigued after playing so much when he was at Heritage. And obviously that course was a terrible fit. He's had some time. He's back here. And if he's in his groove, he is just such a better golfer. So something to consider. And I think what we will see, just hypothetical, I think we'll see pretty high ownership on Day and Rose and some of the higher stake stuff, which is indicative to me that they're good plays. So final thoughts, I guess, on that top tier range. Colin, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know in general, and I'm with you, I like to fade these expensive guys, but I really like to fade the most expensive guys when the field is very stacked, like the Masters or something like that, or when you have all the best golfers. I'm going to fade the very top end guys more often than not. But this week more than ever, I'm kind of looking at them, and I know, it's kind of breaking your rule. What are your thoughts? It's a lot of rambling there, but
no, I think it's just like, again, I think I'm coming to the same conclusion from a different. I'm kind of beating a dead horse at this point, but like your ability to roster the top guys really depends on the value in the low guys. The top guys are a known quantity. I agree that even like Day is he's just like when he's on, like he's his upside is not just in Rose's upside when he's in top gear. It is just quantifiably like next level. And that is priced in though, like you said. So
right.
I think it far more depends on I think there's the meat of the lineup is going to be in that low 7K range, and it seems particularly meaty this week.
Right.
This is that's how I get there. It's like, is there enough value that opens up like elsewhere?
And that's totally right. And I that's my process completely. I always tell people, what's the strategy, especially in DFS? Like, do I take stars and scrubs? Do I go more balanced? And I always tell them this is such a dynamic question. It's always week to week.
Yeah, there isn't that. Yeah, I don't agree with that rule either way. Like, what's better, stars and scrubs? Like, no, like it depends on what's there. Like,
right. And then this week, I guess to finalize it, this week, like you said, it really matches up. We have great value. And I do think these guys, some weeks, some weeks the top guys make less sense to me, especially like Heritage Zurich. They make sense this week, and you have the added bonus, which is the most important aspect of having value at the bottom. Because even, let's say, hypothetically, Jason Day, hands down number one value at 12.5, but you hated everyone that was 7,500 and less, you're probably not going to roster him.
Mm-hmm.
This week it makes sense because there's good value. So we've talked about it a lot of different ways, but I think we're on the same page.
Yep.
So, Pete, do you think those guys, the 7K-ish guys that we love, do you think they're going to be public guys that it's going to be easy for, guys to find them and be heavily owned in tournaments? And does that mean that we kind of get in this middle range and fade that strategy in tournaments? Or do you think that there's still an edge in the guys we mentioned in the 7K and then taking Day and Rose?
It depends on what type of tournament you're playing. And I think in the higher stakes, I think it's no secret how it's going to pop for a lot of people. And then a lot of the guys we talked about in the low 7K range will be pretty popular. In the lower stakes tournaments, I don't think you have to worry about it too much because a lot of these guys aren't big names. The guys that are going to be heavily owned in the tournaments are going to be the Roses and the Days and stuff like that. So maybe from a roster construction standpoint, if you're trying to attack tournaments, maybe the strategy is to take, maybe one or two of the guys kind of in that 10K range that we talked about. Maybe, I like the idea of taking Berger and maybe Hoffman together in a tournament instead of Day or Rose, because the guys that I know that are going to be heavily owned in lower stakes are Day and Rose.
Cool. All right, we will end it there. So a lot of interesting tournaments on DraftKings this week as usual. Good time for PGA DFS, I think. We have a lot of content coming this week. Pete, you mentioned the video that you're going to do tomorrow where you kind of walk through your model. And I think that'll be really interesting to see sort of how you adjust for the weather, because you're going to do your video tomorrow on Wednesday once we have a little bit better idea of what the weather's going to look like on Thursday or Friday. So definitely check that out, how Pete adjusts that information. Check out the rest of the content. We got a course breakdown and other stuff coming. Any last words, guys?
I'll make sure to be in the FantasyLabs tournament this week. If we can send that out soon so I can get in today, because it's just getting embarrassing at this point. How much of a donkey I am.
Completely agree. Stop running from the toughest league in all of DraftKings, you coward. We know
I know.
Tough competition.
And it's so tilting because I miss my good weeks too. Like I've only played when I've shit the bed, and now I miss my good weeks. And so, of course, I missed the hot streak, and now I'm going to normalize and I'm going to be in dead last the whole year. So I guess I've come to grips with my fate, but I definitely
You brought it on yourself. I frankly have no sympathy. So
yes, self-inflicted completely. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Good luck this week, and we'll talk to you next week.